Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Taking Care. This is our second session of this, conversation we're having with mental health professionals during very strange times right now. I'm Meredith Goldstein. I write the Love Letters advice column for the Globe and Boston.com. And as I mentioned last week, I'm just getting a ton of letters in my inbox for the advice column that, my advice column is lovely and it is a wonderful group chat that is meant to feel like you're talking about your problems in my living room where we are right now. But there are certain questions, obviously, that I want to direct right to mental health professionals. So in this series, we're talking to those wonderful people. It does not count as real therapy for you in the sense of getting a diagnosis or seeing somebody one-on-one. But I have to tell you, talking to people who work in this world, it's just been really helpful to hear what they have to say, how they advise us, how we can be healthy in our brains as well as our bodies right now. So last week we kicked off with Dr. Monica O'Neill, who is Boston-based, and she talked about living in close quarters and staying at home and general existential dread. Today, I knew exactly who I wanted to talk to for our second session. I am a huge fan of Dr. Drea Letamendi. Just a little bit of background on my one-sided connection to her that is now two-sided. I'm a huge fan of movies, TV, superheroes, Batman in particular. A friend and I have recently rewatched all of Batman, the animated series, which I highly recommend watching if you are home and looking for something comfortable and comfort watching right now. And I was able to find a podcast about superheroes and psychology, Batman specifically, called the Arkham Sessions, where this incredible clinical psychologist talked about mental health through the lens of Batman. And what an education. So I was able to learn about parasocial relationships, about grief I might feel in the world, all different kinds of things, but through this pop culture lens that made it much more digestible to me. So when I wanted to spend a session on healthy escapism and sort of how we're coping right now, Dr. Letamendi was the first person I thought of, and I'm just so delighted you're here and on the West Coast, so you're up super early.
Thank you so much for having me. I was actually excited to change up my routine, my safer at home routine, now that we're a couple weeks into this, and it was very, very delightful to get your invitation, and I'm so excited to talk about these topics today.
Well, I should also mention that I have a cameo friend who's behind me for support. If you can see him, he's Bruce Wayne all dressed up. And I think that Dr. Letamendi has the same Batman behind her.
I have a couple of figures behind me. I have my Mondo action figure. It is Batman from the animated series, and then Mr. Freeze. I thought I would do a little evening out of villain and hero, or anti-hero, however you want to see it.
Yeah, big fan. Okay, so why don't we just start by talking about, can you tell everybody what you do and where you do it?
Absolutely. So I am a clinical psychologist, and I work at UCLA as the interim director of our Student Resilience Center called RISE. And as a clinical psychologist, I also serve in residential life, providing mental health education, essentially supportive consultation, advising, training primarily for students that live on campus and form community on campus. And UCLA is such a huge, thriving community that is incredibly diverse. And so this, what we're experiencing now, as far as social isolation, stay at home actions and orders, and just the constant shifting and changing of things is certainly something that I'm seeing the results of. I'm seeing a lot of impact on our student community.
Thank you. I wanted to start, I'm going to ask a few of my own questions, and then I will absolutely move on to the questions submitted by readers and watchers. And for those who are watching right now, you can submit a question live. If you see that Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you can absolutely submit a question, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And thanks to those who submitted your questions ahead of time. So I want to talk about what we watch for comfort. And our film critic recently said to me that he feels like there are two types of people: the people who want to watch Contagion right now and 12 Monkeys and Outbreak, and the people who want a completely different kind of content right now, perhaps Tiger King. I feel like a lot of people are watching that. Can you talk about why certain pieces of content land as comfort for some people, not for others. And when we want to see stories about what we're facing, what is that about?
Absolutely. I think this is certainly a time that is really showing us what it is what is driving us, what is motivating us to kind of consume media, and what types of media, what kinds of stories are we following. In general, there is this sense of comfort when we go to narratives that are, for lack of a better word, like out of this world. If it's about science fiction, if it's about fantasy, that healthy escapism is a component here. We're looking for moments of just detaching from our experience, from that like real experience, and immersing ourselves in other narratives and stories. Now, the folks that are drawn toward these maybe sort of like apocalyptic, doomsday types of narratives in our media, maybe looking for a sense of control. Like there is this kind of uncertainty happening right now where we're unable to predict what will happen in the next week and even in the next couple of days. So the concept of being next to, being kind of associated with a story that we can follow, that has a beginning, middle, end, that has like a closed narrative, might be a way for us to just get a sense of control. And even though it's irrational, find answers. And I think that can be a healthy way to consume this kind of media, even though I would caution folks to not overconsume that kind of narrative, because it is, it can exhaust us. It can make us feel some negative things. And so I think it's important for folks to balance what they're watching. But it does not surprise me that Contagion was like, the 5th most watched movie on Netflix in the past week.
We spoke about this when we were prepping for this call, and I thought it was really important to share with people. I take a daily walk, and it feels pretty safe in my Jamaica Plain neighborhood. But when I see someone, I am immediately crossing the street. I'm sort of maneuvering my body away, because we're really supposed to stay at a distance right now if we leave the house at all. And it's really changing the way I interact with the world. And in a way that resembles a video game, in a way that resembles like this Walking Dead sort of scary thing. And we were talking about how this might change our relationship to the world around us long term. Can you speak to just how different this is and what it does to our brains when we are suddenly, usually, listen, as a single person who takes a walk, usually I love seeing people, and it's completely different right now.
That's such a wonderful point. I am trying to take walks nearly every day just to kind of get a routine, get exercise, get some sun. Here in Los Angeles, we have such lovely weather, and my neighborhood is a very friendly neighborhood. I have noticed that I'm sort of absorbing some mixed messages and mixed feelings in my brain and body. So for instance, I know as a human being, we're wired to connect with one another. And so usually, even if it's a stranger, if you see another person, the tendency usually is to be somewhat human to human connected with them. Maybe you smile, maybe you wave, maybe you're just polite. But in this social situation, we're given a different message, which is stay away, create a distance. If possible, don't be anywhere near other people. If possible, stay inside. And I think that those mixed messages also create a discordance in our bodies and brain, because we're managing now these new concerns. And the messages, or the anxiety behind those messages is really important. I could become sick, or if I'm asymptomatic, I could make someone else sick. And that makes me kind of worried. And so when I noticed when I was walking around my neighborhood, I was actually walking away from people. And I noticed the other day, I was walking by an older woman, and we both made eye contact, and she looked fearful. And she also kind of created distance. And that's the first time I've ever really experienced this widespread, intense need to not only to create this physical distance, that's not really how humans are wired, but also to see each other, to see other humans as threatening. and to know that I'm a threat potentially to this woman, and vice versa. Now, the flip side of this is how adaptive we are and how we adjust to circumstances like this. And so to see, the neighborhood create new ways to connect, to make comments about each other's pets, to wave from across the street, to smile, to give some signaling that we still care about each other. And that's really been uplifting for me to see how well we're adjusting to all of this. And that's something certainly that I really wanted to name at the beginning of our chat today. This is such an extraordinary time with so many different changes, and there are personal, interpersonal, and in larger occupational, economical consequences of this, and we can't even predict what those things will be. And I think for people to carry that uncertainty and maybe a bit of future-oriented stress, I think that's actually quite normal. And I want folks to feel permission to kind of carry that around and think about ways that they can mitigate those feelings. And it might be through the things we're talking about today.
I'm going to ask this question on behalf of like 25 people who asked it. So assume I'm speaking for all of you. What does it mean to have healthy screen time? Because I think so many people are saying, oh, well, I was limiting my own screen time, my children's screen time, not just meeting news on your phone, but shows you like, video games you play. All of a sudden, we're redefining that. What do you say when you're asked that?
That's a wonderful concern. I think the first step is to just think about what a person needs to do. What do we all need to do to create healthy screen time? So just the concept of knowing that we need to create ritual and routine around this is really important. There is no number. I wish I could tell you, Meredith, this is the exact number and this is how long your break should be, but we're all unique, dynamic individuals, and we all have different situations in our households. So for instance, you might be sharing a computer or device with somebody and you actually need to work that out. Or you might have work responsibilities. My work responsibilities include about 100,000 Zoom calls a day. So I would say one of the first things I started to notice was Zoom fatigue, or this concept that if you're staring at a screen and operating pretty strictly, if you're focusing so much on a screen for several hours, that's not really good for our sense of well-being, but it's also not good for our brains to just have that constant screen time. So a good tip that I try to give my clients as well as friends and family is create a break, create a routine around breaks from screen time, and understand the content of your screen time. So if some screen time is work related, that's out of necessity. Some screen time absolutely should be about entertainment, about joy, about bringing feel good sensations. So that would be, watching Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever streaming channel we're watching. And certainly screen time might be about connecting with other people, which is, paramount. Folks have talked about, the do the 5 for preventing coronavirus spread, elbow, cough, keep a safe distance, stay at home, wash your hands, don't touch your face. We should also kind of build a do the 5 for our social and emotional health right now. What are those 5 things that we should all be thinking about? And the coping literature actually does strongly suggest that there are 5 areas that we should all be thinking about just in terms of adjusting to a crisis like this. One of those things happens to be staying connected. And that means finding ways to engage your personal relationships, friends, family, loved ones, and even folks that you and I don't know each other, but this is one form of us staying connected and being able to listen to each other's experiences, and not only sharing how we feel right now, but also getting that sense of affirmation and validation that someone else gets it. They understand what my experience is. And that is a psychosocial stress reduction practice. It's something that we should all be thinking about doing. And it is absolutely okay to express how you're feeling right now. and to be able to just kind of let that out to folks that we trust.
I know a lot of parents, friends of mine who are parents, are so guilty about, when you talk about screen time, about my kid has been watching 6 hours of television or my kid has been playing video games. And I think about on the young end of the Gen X spectrum. And I think that this has become a very generational conversation that we're having. Many of us were these latchkey kids, right? Where it was totally normal to go home and watch 6 hours of television until mom came home. And in my case, my mother was a piano teacher, so she was teaching and I was watching Who's the Boss and Family Ties and all of these shows. And I felt like, and playing Nintendo for me, the first edition of Nintendo.
We had the same childhood.
Right. It's like, So, and in fact, I'm looking for these shows online, like Kate and Allie and these older shows, because they're so comforting. They represent my childhood. But I always felt like watching characters on television, and even to some extent getting involved in a video game, they weren't as interactive then as like they are with like Animal Crossing and that kind of thing, but taught me about all different sorts of people, and that there were actually lessons in empathy and life that I was getting from that television. And I keep telling my friends, video games and TV made me amazing. Your kids are going to be fine. And then there's like silence on the end of the line. Maybe they don't think I'm amazing. I don't know. But what would you say to parents who are trying to figure out if there are lessons in this screen time that up until now they've been avoiding?
This is very much related to your question about consumption of media. And, what I would just want to be hopeful about is that is in sharing that fandom and fiction, in the way that you just described it, gaming, watching movies, watching television shows, and forming relationships, forming a sense of engagement with characters and narratives that we grow to love. That's a really healthy, adaptive process for young people, for developing teenagers, and for adults. So I think that kind of runs through, it really permeates generations as far as how media and fiction can kind of help us adapt and grow. And you named a couple of things that I think are important. One is that process, that engagement with these narratives and characters, gives us some practice around emotional growth. You talk about grief and loss. Right now, we are experiencing, in many ways, loss. So, a lot of high school and college seniors may not have that graduation experience. A lot of grandparents are not able to be present when their grandchildren are born. There's an incredible amount of missing out on real emotional connections and experiences for a kind of paused, temporary period of time. And what I found is that I have learned so much about how to manage my emotions through this connection with social media, through this connection with fictional media. So for instance, we've talked about the animated series. Batman was one of the first fictional characters that introduced me to like managing my emotions and learning about people that are different than I am, learning about people that make mistakes. Certainly like the concept of good and evil, and why people end up hurting other people, specifically why villains do the things that they do, especially in this show, was eye-opening for me, and ultimately led me to go into psychology, this concept of like what motivates people and how do people's experiences lead them to make the decisions that they make. And sometimes those decisions hurt other people. And how can we better grasp why that happens? Now, to get a little bit more focused on your question, certainly balance is what we want to think about. And so spending too much time in front of the television or in front of a device is not something I would advise, just as a professional and just personally. But we do find that fictional story and storytelling in general has a healing component, and that as witnesses, as people involved emotionally in those stories, we gain a lot in terms of our psychosocial development and how to manage those feelings, how to watch and see other characters manage those feelings, and just how to kind of know what those feelings are like and better equip ourselves to overcome those feelings.
Linda, a reader, asks a great question. She says, what does work-life balance mean right now? She just wants some language for talking about this, whether it's with herself or her colleagues.
That's it's a question we're all asking. And it's interesting because I think a lot of us, especially if we're carrying multiple hats and multiple roles, have been told, practice self-care, practice work-life balance. These are concepts that we've heard before. And now we're wondering, well, okay, what does this look like if I'm, both my spouse and I, or my partner and I are having to work, we're having to work remotely, we have children we need to raise, and now homeschool. And as these shifts and changes occur, so for instance, in Los Angeles, we're likely to have schools open maybe in the fall. And so families are wondering what this is going to look like for them. So I just want to name, like, the feeling of having that disruption and having to completely reframe work-life balance is absolutely real. We have to really just be open to reframing and redesigning what this is for us. But I do think, I have a couple of suggestions. Routine is extremely important. And I know it's a boring concept to think about, like, okay, wake up around the same time and have the same morning ritual and the same kind of work ritual. But there is something pretty reparative about our physical and our psychological well-being when it comes to routine. So typically what I would say is, if you're working and you're having to balance other things at home, create a routine around those expectations. The second thing I would say about that is that kind of the basics of our wellness, like eating and exercising and sleeping, are paramount right now. And those things might be like all out of whack, right? Like, we might not be sleeping well because we feel this disruption. We might be sleeping during the day because we have the opportunity to do that and our bodies are tired or fatigued. And I would say that it's, just paramount that we intentionally think about, how much am I sleeping? How well am I sleeping? Do I have access to healthy food? How can I get access to healthy food? And how can I have regular meals that are good for my body? And exercise is kind of a changing thing now. If I can't go outside and go for a run or a walk, how can I get exercise indoors? But finally, the third thing I'd say about work-life balance is self-compassion and permission to tell ourselves, like, okay, yesterday I really effed that up. I didn't meet my goals, or something didn't quite work out the way I wanted to. And, maybe I didn't get all my checklists done. And I think having a moment to pause and tell ourselves, we're human. This is an extraordinary, unprecedented time for us. It's okay to be kind to ourselves and to tell ourselves, like, yeah, I don't have it together yet, but I have time to work it out.
I don't know if you have this on hand, but a few people have questions about, you had mentioned that there are 5 coping strategies that it turns out for social distancing. And I wondered, you talked a little bit about that, but do you have the sort of tenets of that?
That's a great question. So, today and on your show, you're focusing a lot on staying connected, which is a protective factor when it comes to maintaining our resilience in the face of change and crisis. There are 4 other coping strategies that are helpful for us right now, and I do have them here. The first one is achieving a sense of safety. And that really means your basic needs. Are you psychologically safe? Are you, safer at home is such an interesting concept. Are you actually safe at home? Are you with people that care about you and do not harm you? Are you on your own and feel that you have enough resources available to you to feel independent, to feel self-sufficient? And that's actually one of the other components is self-efficiency and agency. Do you have the ability to access your own internal resources, or know how to get external resources in order to take care of yourself? One other one is to stay calm, to find ways in your life to notice stress and, all the different ways in which our bodies are feeling this pressure, and to be able to self-soothe. That may mean meditation. It may mean getting up and stretching. It may mean listening to a podcast or jumping on something like this and just kind of grounding ourselves in something healthy. And the last one is achieving a sense of hope about the future. And that is hard. I mean, it's different than saying like, wash your hands 20 times a day. Like, okay, how do I achieve a sense of hope about the future? Every time I turn on the news, I'm getting grim and doomsday style reporting. And I think that that goes back to one of your really great points about, just managing, this is from your first episode, managing how much we watch that kind of media, and maybe picking one or two media news sources that are reliable and trustworthy. And, you had a great tip about like maybe create a PDF or just, bookmark it and come back to it rather than constantly stay connected to a streaming style, a 24/7 news cycle that right now is causing, a lot more anxiety and uncertainty in us.
Yeah, and for those who missed that last week, I keep saying, of course, the Boston Globe would love you to sit on at the site all day, I'm sure, but there, you got to take breaks, and there is a version of the Boston Globe that is just sort of a PDF of the day's paper, which for me can sometimes allow me to read without having to constantly get every piece every few minutes. This question is from, and thank you so much for those tips, that's really helpful. This question is from Stephen. He says, I reach out to my friends every day or so on the phone. They sometimes don't answer for a day or two. It used to not bother me before these times, but now it does. How do I deal with this? And I totally hear this question and get it, because as I'm reading it, I'm realizing I owe my cousin a call back, and I'm now, like, I don't want anybody to feel like they're alone through this. So what, how do we manage that panic when somebody doesn't call or when we owe someone a call in this constant state of checking in?
Oh gosh, time is such a different concept right now. I'm experiencing time very differently. Sometimes I'm noticing that the day is super long, and it's like, when is it time to just, watch Netflix and go to sleep, or maybe have a glass of wine? When can I start doing that? So I think a couple of things could be helpful here, and one is to understand who that other person is. This is a very individualized strategy. Instead of having one general idea about how we communicate with people, think critically and think thoughtfully about that other person. So for instance, I had not gotten text messages from my parents and my sister for a few days. And normally in other situations, I wouldn't even have noticed something like that. And, in this last week, I was actually like, wow, I don't know why I'm not hearing from them. Maybe I need to check in with them. And so I think it's fair to say that we're kind of looking at the way in which we communicate a lot differently. And I think it's helpful to check in and be actually quite transparent with why we're checking in and why we're worried, or, why we're calling that person, and switch up the modes in which we communicate. So I normally would text, and maybe I'm thinking like, okay, I'm going to just actually call, and I'm going to articulate as well as I can why I'm trying to get a hold of them. Is it because I'm worried? Is it because, I just want to make sure they're okay? Is it because I'm not okay and I need someone to talk to? And so right now it's helpful to get past maybe those barriers around like self-expression or self-doubt, and even some of the imposter syndrome we feel about like, oh, I don't know if it's okay for me to say to somebody, I don't feel well and I need to talk. But what I found is that people are tremendously adaptive and receptive when we reach out and when we're honest and say, I just want to make sure that you're okay. The other thing that I'd advise is ahead of time, before these distances and before the detachment happens, ask that person, like tell them, okay, so if we haven't talked to each other in a while, how would you like me to reach out? And what can I say for you to know that, I'd like a response in a meaningful time period? And how long is that period for you? And another person might say like, oh yeah, a week. Like I can, like, it's a week is fine. And you might tell them like, oh, wow, for me, if I don't hear back in 2 days, I start to get really anxious. So just again, communicating and being transparent and forming some social contracting around like what the expectations are. I think that can be helpful.
It's a great idea. I know that I have a few friends who I talk to right before bed or text with right before bed, and they are similarly single and live alone. And I think it's that nightly check-in, but it's a contract, right? It's like, you're here, I'm here, now we can go to bed. I want to ask a little bit more of a question that upsets me, so I want to get it over with. But it's important to talk about, I think. I think one of the reasons I have trouble at night and after 5 o'clock is because it's a different news cycle, and we get this stream, whether we're looking for it or not, of the day's horrors and deaths and reports. And sometimes it's good news, and sometimes, a lot of times these days, it's bad news. And sometimes it's about the death of someone we don't know, a celebrity death, someone of note in the community, someone who we would never know. And I find that in some cases I become very numb. And in other cases, last night, a musician and songwriter I really like, succumbed to this. And I was shaken. And I thought, this is very interesting that this person has made music that's touched my life. So of course I would feel this in a different way, but all of these losses are unfathomable, upsetting, it's angering. And I know you've spoken quite a bit about grief in the world that might not be someone we're directly related to. Can you talk about the processing of grief as we hear about strangers, about people who we might know, but only through that sort of, parasocial lens of work? How we're supposed to process this and how our brains do process it?
You mentioned the word parasocial, and I think it's helpful to use that concept and to kind of think through the lens of what a parasocial relationship is. And for folks who are not familiar with that term, I usually will describe it as a non-delusional but very real connection, a relationship with somebody that we don't know. Now, typically the way I use it, because I work a lot in fandom and fiction, is about, I use it in reference to fictional characters who we know aren't real. And when I say a non-delusional relationship, I mean you have a very real, affirming connection to this singer, songwriter, musician, and for a lot of us too, maybe other high-profile figures that we're seeing get sick or succumb to this illness. And one of the first things I would say to that is to affirm and just validate that grief is real, that you are absolutely aware that you may not have ever met that person and you may not know them personally in your life, but that individual has impacted you. That individual has helped you grow, has inspired you, has created a level of thoughtfulness, a level of, emotional growth in some way. I'm making some assumptions, but based on what you described, that might be what this relationship was about. And I think especially for artists, musicians, activists, actors, folks that are, highly visible in the public eye, when something, tremendously traumatic happens to those individuals, we do have a real sense of loss. Right before this crisis, we lost Kobe Bryant to an accident. And that was really for a lot of different populations and communities, and for Los Angeles in particular, there were days of grieving. And I know that some people approached me, a few clients approached me about this and said, I feel guilty and I feel bad that I feel this way because I don't know him. And yet I feel so lost and I feel so hopeless and I feel a tremendous sense of sadness. And, when we talk about how then to realize what is real about that relationship, so many things are real about that relationship. And then as you're talking about this crisis, it is an accumulation of many losses every day, one after the other. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that this accumulation of loss also has an impact on us. It adds to the uncertainty of who's next. It adds to the sadness of the tremendous sudden, the nature of this being so sudden and fast. And then, the sense of knowing that with that person being lost, so much of their talent, their work, what they gave us, what they gave our community is potentially lost with them. So what you're talking about, I think, is just an incredible amount of grieving, and it's very real.
I just want to lighten this very quickly, which is, speaking of parasocial relationships and the relationships you build with people you don't know, when I was listening to Dr. Letamendi's podcast, I found myself shipping, as they say, her with her co-host. And I was like, oh, I think these co-hosts of a podcast, I think they might like each other. I started rooting for them. And then later, in many episodes later, they talk about already being married, something I could miss. And I felt like this strange sense of joy that these, like, almost like TV characters I didn't know had found love and married off. The whole time I was suspecting that they might have a crush on each other. But anyway, it's a silly and wonderful example of this parasocial relationships we share, with people we don't know. So anyway, that was a more joyful example. But
I love that story so much.
This is from Joyce. How can we constructively process the uncertainty of when we can start to interact in person again? What will the new normal look like? And I think this actually speaks to a number of questions that have come in from grandparents who are asking, saying FaceTime with my grandkids is not enough. When you face this sort of bubble life that we're living and there is no end date, what are we supposed to do to deal with that?
That's a tough question. And, a part of me wants to be transparent and say, I don't know all the answers around what will the future look like and what we can look forward to and what we should be worried about. But I will say that we are, as a large community and certainly amongst our smaller communities, as we're interconnected, we are amazing, resilient, adaptable creatures. And as we are now adapting to the new normal of social distancing and staying at home as much as possible, as the next phase of this emerges, and as we're asked then to build in, probably, I'm assuming, in a transitional way and in incremental ways. We aren't going to get everything back at once. Like, let's just be real with that. It's not like one day we wake up and everything will be back to normal. And so some of our grief and loss processing is about the long-term aspects. This is a marathon and not a sprint. So let's think about how that's going to look for each of us. And let's think about how if we transitionally and incrementally get things back in our lives, what is important to us? I think what's important for many of us is purpose. Is it important for you to find, certainly basic needs are important, like toilet paper and water and all the things that hopefully now we're able to find ways to access. Beyond those basic needs, I'd say finding purpose and meaning in this new world. What will that look like? For some folks, it will be working again, just being able to be in a work environment. For those who are essential workers and are in the field now and continuing to work and support those of us who are staying at home, they absolutely need relief. They absolutely need an opportunity to draw upon their own well-being and understand how this has impacted them as well. So I think there needs to be a period of adjustment that might look different for folks who are working harder and harder and in the field and risking their health and their safety for society. And I think we need to acknowledge that that might look different. But I think the best approach we can take just for our mental well-being is acceptance that there will be a lot of change and a curiosity, if not maybe like some spark, some energy around the idea that meaning and purpose will come back for us, and what will that look like for us?
Related to that, this is a great question. We've had a few versions of this. There are a lot of questions about coping, about coping when you work in healthcare, and this idea that when people who've had these incredibly difficult days come home, that they might not want to talk about it. And I know that the people I do know in healthcare are getting bombarded with calls from friends saying, what is it like? What do I need to know? And then they're having to live it again once they're off the clock. So what can you tell them and to the people around them? How can we best support them? And how can we manage our expectations, or how can they set boundaries with us?
The mental health and well-being of the essential workers right now is extremely important. And I appreciate, Meredith, that you're acknowledging that too, because we are concerned about their health and safety. And I think we all need to consider what it must be like. There's this perspective taking that I'm trying to do on a daily basis, which is, you know, what might that be like for them, and how can we support them safely? And one thing that you mentioned that I think is really important is they do need to have moments in their days that they're not immersed in the coronavirus crisis. They need to get their brain functioning out of that crisis mode, because that builds stress, and chronic stress is incredibly toxic to our mental health. And so that's something that I think we need to work on with ourselves, especially if there's someone in our family or someone we know, or you know, if this is a person, or these are folks that are listening now and watching now. I think it's helpful then to use a sense of sharing those coping strategies with our folks that are essential workers and in the field, and in providing them with that space, whether it be, you know, do you need to rest? Do you need to find respite? What are the joyful activities that they can fit into their busy schedule that gets them out, gets their brain and body out of that stress exposure? And that would be like maybe the biggest tip I could give, is find innovative and helpful ways to get them out of that stress exposure.
All right, this is a great question, and I have an add-on to this. How can the archetype concept of the superhero empower us during this time? Do you personally have a comic book hero that you connect with, look up to during this time? And I think this is relevant because I'm watching a lot of people in my life who need heroes. If I call my sister Brett during the Cuomo press conference, she is like, I can't deal with you right now. It's, you know, to me, there is a Batman quality for her, regardless of how anybody thinks of his politics or his policies, or a lot of it has to do with how he's communicating. And he's, you know, Commissioner Gordoning all over the place, right? But you know, can you answer that question and also talk about finding comfort? It might not be in a politician at all. It might be in someone else, but you know, how our brain processes that. And then I do want to know what superhero you turn to, because something tells me it's not Batman. He's not always very reliable.
What a great question. And I'm realizing that the first thing you asked me was what I do. And I do kind of have a superhero double life, in that, you know, by day I'm a psychologist at a university. And then I also work with writers and comic book creators and artists, and I speak about psychological science through the narrative of the comic book landscape. And the archetype of the superhero is, I think, you know, quite an interesting, if not helpful, characterological way that we can access our own sense of, you know, trauma response, resilience, and kind of, you know, overall functioning in terms of our psychology. So it's a great question. You know, first and foremost, I think the superhero narrative in general, because it is a pretty dynamic and diverse landscape, in general is a figure that experiences hardship and finds ways to be prosocial. And I might use the word like, you know, there is a post-traumatic growth usually associated with superhero characters. So with Bruce Wayne, he experiences a pretty significant traumatic event, the death of his parents at a very young age. With even a character like Superman, there is a trauma of his entire society, his planet being destroyed, and, finding his way as a stranger, as a young, baby in a new world, and that adjustment can be challenging. And there are other, certainly there are other ways in which trauma appears in the superhero narrative. And I think that is probably the most interesting part of these narratives, in the sense of wondering with curiosity, how does a person with ostensibly so many powers and such strength overcome something that is psychologically invasive, or that is it has a tremendous impact on them? And how do they get to the other side? What do they do to find that post-traumatic growth? And Batman actually is the character that I'm drawn to. Maybe there's some nostalgia there, because Batman is what I would call like my gateway, like the gateway drug into like the rest of superhero stories. And I would say that he is, for me, the most interesting superhero, in the sense that he is relatable. Like he doesn't have the ability to have, X-ray vision or fly or use like superpowers. He is like us in many ways, in that he needs to access his internal resources, his resilient resources, to make change, to not only help other people, but to secure psychological safety in himself, which he continues to struggle with, page after page, time after time. He is not necessarily the healthiest figure in comic books, but he certainly does not stop trying. He always gets up. And I think that's such an interesting narrative, especially right now. One thing that I do in terms of drawing from these narratives and thinking about how psychology and comics can be woven together is actually Batman's concept of a utility belt. That he doesn't have like a batarang as his just single tool to help other people or to get out of trouble. He has multiple gadgets and tools that he uses in very strategic ways. So whether it's, certainly the batarang is useful, but what if he needs a line launcher? What if he needs, a grapple hook? What if he needs that like smoke bomb to just kind of like scurry out of the way? What if he needs a cryptographic sequencer to decode something? So similarly, when I work with clients, we talk about like, what is in your safety pack? What's in your utility belt? Because I might have something that I like to use, but that may not be as helpful for someone else. So that's kind of the way in which I'm translating these narratives into, helpful strategies that maybe real people could benefit from.
I'm laughing as you say this because the other day I found an old fanny pack. It is not attractive. And I put it on and I began to carry things around my apartment just for ease. And I thought, well, this is quarantine day 15, whatever it was. Now I realize it wasn't a fanny pack. It was my utility belt.
It's your utility belt. And by the way, my best friend from middle school gifted me a caboodle. So now I have a caboodle with like, little compartments, and maybe that could be like a little, toolbox. But yeah, the idea is, let's not wait until we're in trouble. Let's not wait until we're so distressed that we are kind of disoriented and unable to really think with a planful way. What is, ahead of time, put a few things in your metaphorical utility belt so that when you are distressed, when you are feeling, so anxious and maybe so low that you don't know what to do, pull out metaphorically, what did I already pack in my utility belt or fanny pack or caboodle or whatever, to be able to get myself out of this darkness.
I'm not going to read the name of the person who sent this in, even though she absolutely put it in there. It says, how does one deal with a work bully who is ever present in my dining room?
Wow.
I should be laughing. I'm sorry that you're dealing with this. It's just, we're learning so many new things about partners right now. And I think we all need tools for communication about the things that bothered us maybe a little bit are bothering us a lot.
I'm just going to be honest. I have found myself to be a little bit of a different person these last few days, in the sense of maybe being more irritable, and my filter is different. Like I'm just saying things that I regret. And I think I have so much just reflective understanding that everyone's household is different, and that, there isn't going to be a single rule that will be helpful for everyone. But I do believe that if we are sharing space and we're sharing resources and we have few others to be around, then we will see this this conflict come up, whether it's feeling like somebody is constantly present and interrupting your workflow or your focus, or it could be that that you want more connection and the other person is like, get away, I need more space, I need to have distance. So I would say that, one, we should absolutely notice that our stress is going to raise. We should absolutely notice that we may become more irritable. We may be triggered more. We may feel less able to control our emotional responses. That's actually going to happen. That's normal. The literature is showing that domestic violence has increased by 300%. And child abuse and neglect has also increased by a tremendous amount, because family members are confined in spaces and do not have access to the strategies and coping methods that they may be used to diffuse that energy and that anger, that irritability. And so I think it's important to think about, one, how do we have conversations about our needs? So for me, I may say, I need 1 hour a day where I don't see you. Like, just please give me that space and give me that time, and do not take it in an offensive way. And then I will ask, what are your needs socially, interpersonally, for the other person? I've also found that planning time together to address, what for this person, like, what is this interaction about? Does that, typically, I heard the word bullying. I'm not sure if it's completely sarcastic, but if a person is interacting with somebody in a way that's asserting power, or asserting that they need their attention, I would wonder, like, what is it that other person, what are their unmet needs right now? And then address at a calm time, what is it that you need at that time? Because let's handle it, maybe from 8 to 9 a.m. we have just a household meeting, and let's talk about what you need, so that when I get on my Zoom call or at work, my work from home schedule, I don't feel like I get a sense of this disruption.
One thing that occurs to me throughout this entire conversation, and certainly last week, is that we're speaking from this great place of privilege where I'm in my living room with my laptop, with access to you, with access to a video game, my original Nintendo, streaming services, and that there are many people who do not have that, right? I mean, they're operating without this connection to the outside world. I don't know if you have answers to this, and if you don't, we can look into it to provide for people. Right now, I think a lot of people are donating to the production of masks, to the delivery of health equipment. And I wonder if there's a place also where people are raising money to get media and entertainment and necessary tools for lessons and escapism to the people who need it as well. So that might not be something but it's certainly something I want to look into, because every time we mention a screen, a game, a wonderful show, I am devastated that people who need that right now don't have it. So that's something to look into. And similarly, we have a question from Tanya, who asks if you know of any volunteer work that a retired psychologist can do to help right now, which is such a generous and wonderful question, because I think there are a lot of people who need help from mental health professionals and don't even have that system set up for themselves.
These are great questions in the sense that we are looking at a long-term new normal, a long-term change here that will continue to exhaust our current workforce and will continue to diminish the resources, especially for folks who do not typically have access to resources. So maybe a couple of things might be helpful here in sharing. One is that if you are in a neighborhood, or the person you're trying to assist is in a neighborhood near a university or school, there are helpful basic needs resources listed. There's actually Google Docs going around, very kind of simple technology, shareable documents being distributed that show free resources, anything from technology like computers to free classes, like, taking Zoom classes, taking classes around technology use. So online, if you find those school districts, there will be lists of where those resources are and how to access them. If you're near a university, usually a university or college will have available a basic needs resource. And so some searching around that might be helpful. For folks who are in the mental health community, for professionals who are interested in how they can support folks who are needing mental health support, there are a couple things that we could do. I know folks who are already in clinical practice and licensed, and they are forming either individually or in group practices pro bono support. And I'm seeing their announcements on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So I'm seeing a lot of helpful and strategic psychologists do this. If that's you though, and you don't have a private practice, and you maybe want to get back into the field, checking with your local board, so your board of psychology or your board of social work, and checking Psychology Today and the APA, the American Psychological Association, for how you can contribute. There's a tremendous amount of strategies and tips that are listed on those websites, and the call to action is there. So I imagine that there will be more and more connecting ways in which folks who have the ability to help, and the organizations and the centralized ways in which they can connect folks to individuals who need the help will be built. And then I will say that for folks who maybe are unlicensed and not mental health providers, I think there are still ways to contribute to this conversation, which is to find these helpful resources and share them online. A lot of helpful strategies and self-care tips are available for free. One of the things that I worry about is that folks do not have access to affordable mental health treatment. And so a lot of this information is available through social media, podcasting, through websites like the APA, to find ways to manage and cope during this time.
Thank you so much. I just want to say, speaking of podcasts, we've talked about Batman, the animated series, which is a very specific thing. I think it's on Amazon. So just for those who are wondering, I think it is available right now streaming on Amazon Prime. It's definitely in various places. And I highly recommend watching with family and listening to the Arkham sessions at the same time, because it's just a great activity and such a great lesson. And of course, there's also the Love Letters podcast. And if you didn't get questions answered today, and you've just got general relationship questions and want to vent and share, and I think people are getting a lot of empathy practice and group therapy type feelings with advice columns right now, you can email loveletters@globe.com, and the column is at boston.com/loveletters. We will do another session of Taking Care next week, specifically with a family therapist who can tell us a lot about kids and parenting, and something I am not dealing with at all right now. So my heart goes out to all of you who are really challenged with that. You're a wonderful family. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Letamendi. I could talk to you about Batman for literally forever. And thank you for non-comic book people. Thank you for putting up with my few specific, very Batman-y questions. But I do think it's a great way to look at the world, like these characters we love and what they can tell us about ourselves and our own struggles. And you are delightful, and it's just so wonderful to have this conversation. So thank you so much, and I hope you stay safe out there. And as I say to everyone these days, I wish you health and toilet paper. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Meredith. It was a pleasure to join you, and I wish everybody a safe, healthy, and also a joyful experience during this time. It's really important to do the things that you're doing here, which is to invite conversation and think of ways just to inspire and build hope during this time. So thanks for doing that.
Okay. All right. And everybody, we'll see you on the column and next week. Thank you so much.